Hey kids, this is Ivan. How you doing? Well, it is day 15 of RPG A Day 2018. And today's question is a tricky one. No pun intended. It really is, or it was for me. And so our question or prompt is describe a tricky RPG experience that you enjoyed. And so I had to think about that for a while. That was one of those questions that I was kind of dreading. Like, man, I'm not really sure what I'm going to say about this. So I had to kind of mull it over a little bit, because at least for me, like when I think about like a tricky experience, something that this is tricky to me, that kind of implies intention. Implies like a desired outcome, or maybe at least avoiding an undesirable outcome. It implies something that's difficult or challenging, but it's something that I want. So this is now tricky. How do I get this? And so there's a lot of different ways that we can envision what might be a tricky RPG situation, which gave me a little bit of problem. Like, what do I talk about here? Because it could simply be something that's like in-game. Doesn't matter if it's in character or out of character. The idea that there's some kind of logistical planning you need to do, or there's a heist or a caper you need to pull off, or maybe it's a negotiation, or an investigation, or maybe it's just an ambush. How do we get inside this place and get the thing to do, get the stuff to do the thing, all that kind of stuff. Very goal-driven, and this could be very tricky, all those puzzles and whatnot, and they could be very, like I said, very in character or very out of character, very just for the players, just a tricky puzzle. How do we do this? Or it could be something that's tricky entirely out of the game, but having to do with the game, like logistically getting a bunch of people together. Like, when do we all actually, we live across the world. How do we all, how do we schedule this? And I've certainly been involved in some very tricky logistical situations, like how do we get everybody together? Heck, even if you all live in the same town, we're all adults and we have responsibilities, it's tough to get like 3, 4, 5 people together, and when you actually get a group that can make it all the time, or mostly all the time, that's a pretty cool thing, because that can be kind of tricky. Just as tricky is navigating and dealing with the various intentions or biases or preferences or desires for experience, expectations, and sometimes juggling all that kind of stuff. That can be kind of tricky too when you get a bunch of people together and realize you might not all entirely be on the same page. You have to have those talks, which we talk about all the time. It could be, as a game master, it's tricky to provide or create some kind of experience. Maybe it's ensuring a particular outcome, or maybe it's making sure that you're not directing it towards a particular outcome. Maybe you're just trying to create a certain kind of feel or tone or genre. Maybe you want to manage the story. Maybe you're trying to create and maintain some kind of illusion. Maybe it's just a matter of, like, how do you manage to scratch the itch of all these various different players that all have slightly different things that they want. And a friend of mine has talked about that recently, and that can be tricky. So there's various things that could be kind of tricky too. Don't worry, I'm going to get to my actual tricky example, my real answer. But still, there's a lot of stuff to think about. How do you do this, or what do you choose? Something tricky is just learning a new system, especially without infecting it with your knowledge of old systems and may want it to be like that, or without kind of poisoning it in some kind of manner. Having discussions about this experience that we're having and providing feedback to each other, especially when things maybe aren't going well. That can be kind of tricky as well. Learning how to use mechanics and role play at the same time. That can be really tricky, especially if a system has all kinds of like meta involvement. And I've talked about my experiences with some games recently where it took a while for us to really be able to do that. Any technique at all you use in role-playing games can be really tricky at first. And so, what do I talk about? I'm going to talk about something that has happened to me very recently. And I've mentioned this before, so if you made it this far, congratulations. It was an experience that I've had in my Lamentations in Mars game. Lamentations of the Martian Princess. And so there were a couple things that were a little bit tricky about this. I've talked about this already in some videos, but we wanted to go for this kind of sword and planet feel. And I didn't want to just buy another game off the shelf or whatever. I figured, let's use this system. I want to mess around a little bit. So it was pretty good. We came with this pretty good kind of scenario ideas. But like I started to realize, well, this is getting a little bit. It's still not quite Sword and Planet. It's still a little bit fantasy-ish. And we've been talking about, like, well, what can we do to change this a little bit? But hasn't been all that tricky. It's just been a conversation we've been having. Everybody's been having fun so far. So that really wasn't the tricky part. The tricky part was last session. They go to this old ruin, and it was something they didn't have to go, but they were interested in getting more of this particular relic that they got. They got one already, and so let's get some more of these relics. So there was a guy that knew where the relics were, and he's a little bit nuts, so he agrees to take him to where the relics are. They make it there, and in this little ruin, I had a bunch of little things that they could possibly engage with. things that might just randomly show up. There was a wandering monster chart, things that might actually show up at some point. If they spent a lot of time there, they probably would have found these particular people or monsters or whatever things were in there. However, there was another thing in the area that they could engage with if they so chose, and essentially what it was a device that could open up portals to different places and different times, and it was kind of random. So as they're messing around with this, trying to take the power source out, it opens up these portals. They can see one place that's in a different spot. No real clue if it was a different time or not. They don't know if it was a different time, and I'm not going to tell you because they're watching. And then they open up another portal to the city they just came from. And it was, which took them like several days to actually get there. But they notice, they ask some good questions. They notice that something's wrong. The stars are wrong. And then they see a little flying machine go across, and they realize it's the wrong season, but there's no flying machines as far as they know where they're from. And so they start to realize they're looking into the past. They're not sure, but they think this was probably the past. And they guessed right, by the way. And at this particular point, I do my little wandering check because it's time to do a little wandering check. And it turns out there's this NPC that's left over from the last expedition that was there that shows up. And there's something a little bit odd about him. And I can't tell you what because they're watching. They'll find out sooner or later. And they haven't decided to go back through this portal to go back in time, which I thought might be kind of interesting. It was just kind of a little dangling carrot. You want to do this or not? Likewise, this other guy they would have interacted with, had they hung out with him long enough, something very interesting would have happened. He was not exactly a normal person. So, I didn't really anticipate the idea of these two things intersecting, especially when they have this device up and working, kind of tenuously, but it's kind of working. So I had to think to myself, what would this particular person do if they saw the town that they were from after spending about a month in this awful place? Well, I guess he would probably try to go home. So I decided he would try to go home, and nobody wanted to stop him. And then after a while, the portal shimmered. Nobody wanted to go follow him. Then I had to think to myself, here's where it gets tricky, but this was tricky and enjoyable. I had to think to myself, what would happen if this particular person, with the particular oddity they had, were to go back in time? And essentially what happened is, as they went back to town and found out that things were radically different, he altered the timeline significantly, and a particular race that was involved in the war, which kind of was the cataclysm. And if you go watch the Lamentations and Martian Princess little teaser or whatever, and you'll figure out what's going on with that. I'm not going to go through it. I'll play Lincoln or whatever. I had to recreate everything about the world. Go back, several hundred years and figure out what would happen if these things changed. And I'm still kind of tweaking some of the things. So that was a very tricky situation. So all of a sudden, this entire world that I had developed, that they had kind of given me some ideas about as well, now it's all different. And I had to logically figure out what would happen here. And so now they're discovering this new place. We get to make it more Sword and Planet because there are some aspects or things that happen which make it a little bit more mixing of the various technologies and whatnot than it happened before, when it was very like post-war sort of thing. So it's very, very different now. It's been very tricky to figure out what would happen. That's one of those things, like, I love playing to find out because you never know what's going to happen. And sometimes the tricky part is, as the game master, when these unforeseen things happen, especially when you're messing with the timeline, you're crossing the streams and all that kind of stuff. Well, geez, what would happen here? So that was tricky. I had to figure all this stuff out and pretty much kill my darlings and scrap everything that I created before because, well, it simply didn't happen that way anymore. So that's a little tricky. And that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. What about you?